All right, ready to dive deep into World War II.
Ready when you are.
But not the World War II you're probably thinking of.
Definitely not.
We're skipping the battles and dates everyone memorizes in school.
Putting those aside for today.
We're going way beyond that typical timeline.
Big picture stuff.
That's right, and we've got some really fascinating sources to work with today.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
We've got scholarly analyses, we've got high school textbook sections.
A little bit of everything.
And we've even got some really powerful first-hand accounts sprinkled in.
Personal stories, yeah. Can't beat those.
Exactly, and that's what makes this deep dive so unique.
I think so too.
We're using all of these different sources to answer the why behind World War II.
You're getting at the underlying causes.
We're going to explore some of the lesser-known stories.
The stuff you don't usually hear about.
And we'll really get a sense of how everyday people experience this global conflict.
Yeah, the human side of things.
It's all about getting a more complete picture.
Moving beyond those simplified narratives.
Right, so, big question right off the bat.
Let's hear it.
Was appeasing Hitler really the best option at the time?
A big debate.
What was it like being a Black American fighting a war on two fronts?
The Double V campaign, yeah, we'll get into that.
Could the U.S. have prevented putting Japanese Americans in internment camps?
Tough question.
And then, of course, we're diving into the decision to drop the atomic bomb.
The big one.
We'll examine the arguments for any against it.
The whole spectrum of viewpoints.
Okay, so to start us off, let's rewind a bit.
Back in time.
What was the world like before the war broke out?
Pre-war days.
What led to this massive global conflict?
Setting the stage.
I think it's easy to jump right into battles.
You see that a lot, yeah.
But to really grasp the impact of World War II,
Gotta look deeper.
we need to go back a bit further
Back to the beginning.
and look at the Treaty of Versailles.
The one that ended World War I.
Yeah, World War I, that's the agreement that officially ended it, right?
Yeah, officially, yes.
But I've heard it actually caused more problems than it solved.
It's a common argument.
So break it down for us.
Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles was incredibly harsh on Germany.
Punishing them, basically.
You could say that. It blamed them for World War I,
Okay.
and it imposed crippling reparations.
Meaning?
Germany had to pay huge sums of money to the victors.
Okay, so how did that lead to World War II?
Well, those reparations absolutely devastated the German economy.
Like, how bad are we talking?
We're talking hyperinflation so bad that at 1.5 million German marks were worth less than a single U.S. penny.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, imagine that chaos in your daily life.
I can't even imagine.
Total economic turmoil.
Seems like the perfect breeding ground for resentment.
Absolutely. And instability, too.
Right, ripe for extremist ideologies.
Exactly.
Powerful leaders like Hitler.
He knew how to exploit that anger.
So he steps in, promising to restore Germany's greatness,
Playing on their national pride.
blaming the treaty for all of their suffering.
Scapegoat, yeah.
And people were just desperate for change.
Any kind of change at that point.
Right. But it wasn't just Germany feeling the effects of World War I.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
The Treaty of Versailles also left Italy and the Soviet Union feeling pretty slighted.
Oh, interesting.
They both felt they didn't get what they deserved.
Yeah, like they hadn't been rewarded enough for their contributions to the war effort.
Absolutely.
So now you've got these major world powers.
Germany, Italy, Soviet Union,
All struggling after World War I.
economically, politically, the whole 9 yards.
So a recipe for disaster, it sounds like.
Right. In a way, yeah.
This widespread discontent,
Simmering beneath the surface.
paired with the rise of totalitarian regimes in some countries,
Leaders seizing power.
created this, like, perfect storm for another global conflict.
Yeah, you could say that.
It's amazing how something that happened decades earlier could have such a huge impact.
Like a ripple effect.
One thing leads to another.
Chain reaction.
And remember, while all this political maneuvering was going on,
Behind closed doors.
everyday people were just living their lives,
Going about their business.
completely unaware of how quickly things were about to change.
Oblivious.
One of our sources actually describes it.
Oh, really?
Hearing bombshells exploding on a normal city street,
Can you imagine?
with the sounds of streetcars and cars still in the background.
Wow, that's chilling.
Yeah, really illustrates how suddenly the world shifted for those caught in the conflict.
Overnight, everything changes.
Makes you realize World War II wasn't just about leaders making
It
decisions.
was about the people.
Millions of them.
Absolutely.
Suddenly thrown into a world of violence and uncertainty.
Their whole world turned upside down.
It's easy to think about World War II in black and white terms,
Good guys versus bad guys.
but it sounds like it was so much more complicated than that.
Oh, way more nuanced.
Right, so much gray area.
Exactly. World leaders faced incredibly difficult choices,
Impossible choices, probably.
oftentimes with limited information,
And under immense pressure.
the weight of the world on their shoulders.
Okay, so one of the decisions that always comes up is the policy of appeasement towards Hitler.
Appeasement.
Can you explain what that was all about?
Well, appeasement, while controversial,
Very controversial.
yeah, was basically a strategy of giving in to some of Hitler's demands
Giving him what he wanted.
in the hope of preventing another large-scale war.
So they were basically trying to avoid another World War I.
Exactly. The memory of World War I was still very fresh.
People were terrified of another war.
Understandably so.
Makes sense, but wouldn't that just make Hitler think he could get away with anything?
That was the risk.
Was there really no other option?
Well, many leaders at the time genuinely believed that giving Hitler some of what he wanted, like control over a region in Czechoslovakia,
A small price to pay for peace.
that was the thinking, that it would satisfy him and keep the peace.
But obviously, appeasement didn't work, right?
You're right, it backfired.
Big time.
Hitler saw appeasement as weakness, and it just emboldened him.
Gave him more power.
He kept taking more and more, and eventually it led to the outbreak of war.
So even at the time, people were debating what to do.
Lots of different opinions.
What was the best course of action?
Tough call.
One of the most vocal critics of appeasement was Winston Churchill.
Ah, Churchill.
He actually gave a speech in 1938 where he warned that appeasement would only lead to more aggression from Hitler.
He saw it coming.
Do you remember what he said?
He said, "We have passed an awful milestone in our history,
Heavy stuff.
and do not suppose that this is the end. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year by year, unless, by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor, we arise again and take our stand for freedom as in the olden time."
Wow, those are some powerful words.
He didn't mince words.
Especially knowing what happened afterward.
It makes him even more significant.
It's like he knew exactly what was coming.
He had a good grasp of the situation.
It seems like he really understood the dangers of appeasement.
Yeah, he did.
So, we've talked about all these complex political factors that led up to the war.
The stage was set.
But I think it's so important to remember that war is ultimately about people.
At its core, yeah.
It's about the human cost.
The individual stories.
And that's why we wanted to include those firsthand accounts today.
They're so important.
To really drive that point home.
Absolutely.
To understand the real human cost of this conflict.
Yeah, going beyond the statistics and the dates.
You know, reading through some of those stories, it's just striking how these big historical events played out in the lives of everyday people.
How it affected them personally.
Right. So let's actually take a look at some of those accounts.
I'm ready when you are.
One that really stood out to me was from Gerda Weissman-Klein.
Holocaust survivor.
She describes the moment she was separated from her mother.
During the Nazi roundups.
She talks about being forced to line up with her mother.
Horrible.
And an SS officer asking her age.
Oh, gosh.
She said 18.
Just a teenager.
And he pushed her to one side.
Separating them.
And her mother to the other.
It's heartbreaking.
Shortly after, trucks arrived.
To take them away.
And they were loaded onto them.
Just like cattle.
She describes hearing her mother's voice asking, "Where to?" from a distance.
So awful.
And shouting back, "I don't know!"
You could just feel the fear and confusion in her words.
It makes you wonder, were these separations unavoidable?
Given the chaotic circumstances?
Or were there other factors at play?
Deliberate cruelty, maybe?
What do our sources say about the logistics of the Nazi roundups?
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
And one that historians continue to debate.
Really?
Some argue that the sheer scale of the Nazi operation made those kinds of separations inevitable.
Just too much chaos.
Right. But others point to evidence suggesting that there was deliberate cruelty involved.
Oh, wow.
A desire to break the spirit of the Jewish people.
That's a difficult truth to confront.
It is.
We also have accounts from soldiers on the front lines.
Those are always powerful.
One of the sources describes the soldier's first kill.
I remember that one.
With such raw honesty.
Yeah, it's hard-hitting.
He was pinned down by enemy fire.
Taking cover.
watching a tank advance towards him and his buddy
Oh, no.
and making a split-second decision
Life for death.
to lure the tank away from his wounded comrade.
Putting himself in danger.
He survives,
Thank goodness.
but his friend doesn't.
It's a stark reminder of the brutal realities of war.
And the toll it takes on those who fight
Absolutely.
forces you to confront the moral complexities,
Yeah, of taking a human life.
even in the context of war.
Right, war is hell.
But even amidst all that darkness and violence, there are glimmers of hope.
There are.
We have this letter from a soldier writing home during basic training.
A little bit of light.
He talks about how much happier he is than he's ever been.
That's nice to hear.
How proud he is to be an American.
Patriotic.
And how seeing the poverty in Europe made him appreciate what he has back home.
Putting things into perspective.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
It is.
Even in the midst of this devastating global conflict,
Yeah.
he's finding meaning and purpose in his service.
Funding the good.
It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit
Sure.
and the power of hope, even in the darkest of times.
Hope keeps us going.
It really does.
It does.
You know, all of these stories, these personal experiences,
They really bring it home.
they really drive home the point that war is about so much more than battles and strategies,
It's about people.
individual lives, experiences, and sacrifices.
Exactly.
And speaking of sacrifices,
Yeah.
let's shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and talk about the American home front.
Those who stayed behind.
Yeah, we tend to think of the home front as separate from the war,
In a way.
but it was deeply affected too.
Oh, absolutely.
The entire nation mobilized to support the war effort.
Everyone had a role to play.
And everyday life changed dramatically for those who stayed behind.
In so many ways.
We all know about Rosie the Riveter.
The iconic image.
The image of women working in factories.
Taking on new roles.
But it was a lot more than that, right?
Oh, yeah. Way more.
One of the biggest changes was rationing.
Limited supplies.
Things like meat, sugar, coffee, even gasoline,
Essential goods.
carefully controlled,
To make sure there was enough for everyone.
both civilians and the military.
Equal distribution.
So rationing meant families had to make do with less.
Tightening their belts.
But how did that actually support the war effort?
Logistically speaking.
Was it really that impactful?
Hugely impactful.
Do you think so?
Think about it. By limiting how much people could buy, the government could control prices,
Makes sense.
prevent inflation.
Okay, yeah.
At the same time, rationing freed up resources.
For the war effort.
Exactly. Things like producing weapons and supplies.
So it's fascinating how something that seems relatively small
Like limiting sugar.
could have such a significant impact on a global conflict.
It all adds up.
It really highlights how interconnected everything was during wartime.
For sure.
And it wasn't just rationing.
Nope.
People were planting victory gardens,
Growing their own food.
participating in scrap drives to collect metal for war production,
Recycling for the war effort.
buying war bonds to help finance the war.
Putting their money where their mouth is.
So it wasn't just about the government telling people what to do.
No, it was more than that.
It sounds like there was a real sense of collective effort,
Everyone working together.
this shared understanding that everyone needed to do their part.
National unity.
Yeah, the war transformed American society in a lot of ways,
It did.
brought people together,
Closer than ever.
fostered a sense of national unity,
For the common good.
created this sense of shared purpose
Absolutely.
that extended far beyond the battlefield.
Back home, too.
But of course, it wasn't all positive, right?
Unfortunately, no.
Our sources also mention a much darker side to the home front.
The internment camps.
The internment of Japanese Americans?
A dark chapter in American history.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor,
Everything changed.
fear and prejudice towards Japanese Americans just exploded.
Understandable, but misplaced.
Many of whom were American citizens.
Born and raised in the U.S.
The government responded by ordering the forced relocation and incarceration of over 110,000 Japanese Americans.
Hard to believe.
It's hard to believe that something like that could happen in a country that prides itself on freedom and justice.
A real contradiction.
What was the justification for such a drastic measure?
Well, officially, the government claimed it was a matter of national security,
Protecting the country.
saying that Japanese Americans posed a threat.
But
But in reality,
there was no evidence to support that claim.
none whatsoever.
It was purely driven by racial prejudice and wartime hysteria.
Fear and anger.
We have a first-hand account from Monica Itoi-Son,
She was there.
a Japanese-American teenager who was sent to an internment camp with her family.
A powerful story.
She writes, We were going to live in horse stalls.
Unbelievable.
It was incredible. What kind of logic was
It
this?
makes no sense.
Round up all the Japanese, stick them in a barbed wire enclosure, and the war would be won.
Ridiculous.
The whole situation was a nightmare. What had we done that was wrong? Weren't we American citizens?
Her words really capture the shock and disbelief.
That so many Japanese Americans felt.
Absolutely.
Imagine being uprooted from your home,
Losing everything.
separated from your community,
Torn apart.
forced to live in cramped, unsanitary conditions,
Awful condition.
simply because of your ancestry.
It's heartbreaking.
And it's even more disturbing to know that this wasn't just some isolated incident.
It was systemic?
The internment was a systematic policy backed by the government
Orchestrated from the top?
and even upheld by the Supreme Court.
It's shocking.
Executive Order 9066
Signed by President Roosevelt.
authorized the military to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded.
Targeting Japanese Americans.
And the Supreme Court, in the Korematsu case,
a landmark case.
actually ruled that the internment was constitutional,
Can you believe that?
citing military necessity.
A weak justification,
It's a decision that's widely condemned today.
as it should be.
A blatant violation of civil liberties,
Absolutely.
fueled by fear and racism.
At its core.
It's a stark reminder that even in a democracy, individual rights can be trampled upon.
Especially during times of crisis.
Which brings us to another complex and controversial issue.
The atomic bomb.
The atomic bomb.
A turning point in history.
Its use at the end of World War II is still hotly debated today.
For good reason.
While it's often presented as the event that ended the war,
The simple narrative.
the reality is much more complicated.
As always.
So let's unpack this a bit.
Okay.
What were the reasons given for using the atomic bomb?
Well, proponents of the bomb argued that it would save countless American lives.
They didn't want to lose any more soldiers?
Lives that would have been lost in a land invasion of Japan.
Makes sense.
They also believed it would bring a swift end to the war.
Preventing further bloodshed?
On both sides.
And of course, there was the geopolitical aspect.
Right. Asserting U.S. dominance in the post-war world.
A show of force.
You could say that.
Those are some compelling reasons.
They are.
But our sources also highlight strong arguments against using the bomb.
There were many.
What were those?
Well, critics argued that the human cost was simply too high.
Too many civilian casualties.
The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki instantly killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians.
It's hard to fathom that level of destruction.
And countless others suffered from radiation sickness in the years that followed.
Long-term effects.
Yeah, devastating.
Critics also question whether Japan was truly on the verge of surrender,
Was the bomb really necessary?
suggesting that other options like continued conventional bombing or diplomatic pressure could have been explored.
A more peaceful resolution.
So it sounds like there wasn't a clear consensus,
A lot of division.
even within the U.S. government.
Strong opinions on both sides.
What was President Truman's justification for ultimately making that decision?
To drop the bomb.
Yeah, to drop the bombs.
Well, Truman saw the atomic bomb as a military weapon,
Just another tool in the arsenal.
and he firmly believed it was his duty to use every available resource to end the war quickly.
And save American lives.
He wrote in his memoirs, "I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used."
A very clear stance.
Yes,
But not everyone shared his view.
definitely not.
Many people, including some of the scientists who helped develop the atomic bomb, were horrified by its destructive power
They knew what they had created.
and argued against its use.
A moral dilemma.
Do you remember any specific figures who voiced their opposition?
Dr. Leo Szilard, one of the key figures in the Manhattan Project, was very vocal.
The Manhattan Project, that was the top secret program to develop the bomb.
Right. Szilard argued that using such a devastating weapon without warning was morally reprehensible.
A line that shouldn't be crossed.
He felt it would set a dangerous precedent for future conflicts.
Opening Pandora's box.
Exactly. And even General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later become president himself, expressed serious reservations.
Really?
He felt it was completely unnecessary to achieve victory.
So Japan could have been defeated without it.
That was his opinion.
He questioned the need to unleash such destructive power on civilian populations.
It's a valid point.
So we're left with this incredibly difficult question.
A question that haunts us still.
Was the atomic bomb a necessary evil?
To end the war,
Or was it a tragic misstep with consequences that continue to reverberate to this day?
A question with no easy answers.
It's a question that historians and ethicists continue to grapple with.
We're still trying to understand the full impact.
It definitely leaves a lot to think about.
It does.
World War II wasn't just an isolated event.
Right. Its impact was felt everywhere.
Its legacy continues to shape our lives today.
Absolutely.
One of the most significant outcomes was the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers, right?
Yeah. The war left this power vacuum in Europe and Asia.
And the US and Soviet Union stepped right in.
They filled the void,
It's like we went from one major conflict straight into another.
although a very different kind of conflict, yeah.
The Cold War.
Exactly.
So even though World War II was officially over,
The fighting stopped.
this competition between the US and the Soviet Union continued,
It had a global impact.
shaping global events,
For sure.
affecting everything from foreign policy to military spending to scientific advancements.
Yeah, it cast a long shadow.
Amazing to think how a war that ended in 1945 could have such a lasting impact on the second half of the 20th century.
It just shows how significant it was.
But hey, it wasn't all doom and gloom.
Not entirely, no.
The war also led to the creation of the United Nations,
The UN.
this global organization dedicated to maintaining peace and international cooperation.
A symbol of hope.
So did the UN really come about because of World War II?
It did.
I mean, the horrors of the war really convinced world leaders that something had to change
A new system was needed.
to prevent future global conflicts.
Absolutely.
They wanted a forum where nations could come together,
Talk it out.
discuss their differences, resolve disputes peacefully.
Diplomacy over violence.
Yeah, a symbol of hope,
Born out of the ashes of war.
a collective desire to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.
Learning from history.
Exactly. The UN wasn't perfect,
No organization is.
but it was a step in the right direction.
Towards a more peaceful world.
And speaking of preventing future conflicts, didn't World War II also lead to the Nuremberg trials?
Oh, yeah, a pivotal moment.
Holding Nazi leaders accountable for their crimes?
They were held responsible.
That must have been a huge shift in how people thought about war.
And individual responsibility.
It was the first time individuals were held responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity.
A new era of accountability.
So the Nuremberg trials set a precedent that had implications far beyond World War II
It established principles of international law
that are still used today.
to prosecute individuals for atrocities.
Wow. So something that emerged from the horrors of World War II
From the darkest of times,
could have such a lasting impact on global justice.
a glimmer of hope
Incredible. Okay, so we've talked about the global impact of the war,
on a grand scale.
but what about its effects on American society?
Things changed back home, too.
One example that comes to mind is the GI Bill,
Oh, the GI Bill.
which provided educational opportunities and home loans to millions of returning veterans.
A real game changer.
It gave millions of veterans access to higher education
The chance to go to college.
and helped them buy homes.
The American dream.
It led to a surge in home ownership.
And a more educated workforce.
It's amazing how that one program helped shape the American dream for an entire generation.
It had a profound impact.
And our sources also mention that World War II played a role in the fight for civil rights in the United States.
It did.
How so?
The war experience had a huge impact on African Americans.
Many of whom served with distinction in the armed forces,
They fought bravely for their country.
only to return home to face continued discrimination and segregation.
It's just not right.
They risked their lives fighting for democracy abroad,
For freedom.
only to be denied basic rights at home.
It's a tragic irony.
But it galvanized the civil rights movement.
It did.
Black veterans were determined to fight for equality.
They knew they deserved better.
One of our sources mentioned the Double V campaign,
Oh, yeah. Victory abroad and victory at home.
calling for victory against fascism overseas and victory against racism at home.
Two fronts in the same war.
So World War II actually helped energize the fight for racial equality,
In a way, yes.
exposing the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while denying it at home.
It was a wake-up call.
Okay, one last thing.
Sure.
World War II also led to the rise of what some call a permanent wartime economy.
The military-industrial complex.
What does that mean?
Well, during the war, the U.S. government poured massive resources into the military and defense industries.
To win the war.
Right. This led to a huge expansion of the military-industrial complex.
Oh.
It's in a shift towards a more militarized economy.
So even after the war ended, the U.S. continued to invest heavily in its military and defense capabilities.
It became a priority,
Some argue that this was necessary to maintain U.S. power and security.
especially during the Cold War.
But others point to the negative consequences of this militarization
like the drain on public resources.
and the potential for increased military interventionism.
It's a double-edged sword.
A war fought to defeat fascism and defend democracy also led to a significant increase in military spending.
And a more militarized society.
It's a reminder that even wars fought for noble causes can have unintended consequences.
Something to think about.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into World War II, I'm left with a question.
Go ahead.
If World War II really did reshape the world in such profound ways,
What you did.
what aspects of our lives today can we actually trace back to that conflict?
It's a great question.
It's something to ponder.
Look around you. Consider the political landscape, the international institution,
The technological advancements,
social movement.
even the way we think about war and peace.
So much of our world today is connected to World War II.
It's like ripples spreading out from a stone dropped in a pond.
Exactly. The war's impact is still felt.
Decades later.
History shapes our present.
That's it for our deep dive into World War II.
Thanks for listening.
We covered a lot today.
From the causes of the war to the personal stories.
To the global impact and its legacy.
It's a complex and fascinating topic.
We hope you found it insightful.
And informative.
And we encourage you to continue exploring this pivotal moment in history.
Read more, think critically.
Dive deeper into the sources.
Engage in thoughtful discussions.
Because understanding the past
Helps us navigate the present.
and shape a better future.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
See you then.